Well, this is without doubt the topic of the hour. The wars, the rumours of wars, the preparation for war is now the environment in which we all live. Conscription has been reintroduced in Germany, in France, in Belgium, in Holland. It was part of the Tory Party's manifesto at the last election, and a kind of weak version of it. Thankfully, weak version of it has been introduced by Keir Starmer, which in typically sort of half-hearted way is a cross between an apprenticeship and a day in the Boy Scouts. But I think it would be foolish to think that the British government won't be following this route. I think is almost inevitable it will, because arms spending in this country has risen by 53% since 2020, and this is in a country where 1 in 3, think about that, 1 in 3 children is in poverty. So this is the framework of the modern world, and one of the effects of Donald Trump's breach with NATO is that the European powers are engaged in a massive rearmament program. I think the signal event of that is the discussions now underway to turn Volkswagen's Osnabrück plant from car production to missile production, and that missile production will be for Israel's Iron Dome defense missile system. Think about the significance of that. Volkswagen, born as the vehicle producer for the Nazi regime, then one of the most successful car companies in the world, now engaged in some 50,000 layoffs in Germany, but turning over one of its iconic plants to missile production. So this talk is about why this keeps happening. Why is it that generation after generation, through centuries now of capitalist development, have faced moments like this, when the nation states of which they're a part are preparing for or engaged in warfare. And to understand that, and we have to understand the imperial system before we can understand what the effective responses, the effective anti-imperialist responses are to that system. And the reason why it's a recurrent and eradicable part of the capitalist system is because it's built deep into the fundamental structure of capitalism. This isn't something which is a terrible accident, a mere avoidable collision between states, the product of poor diplomacy, although all those things can play their part. This is to do with something absolutely fundamental in the way in which the system is constructed. And Marx, in one of those phrases that Marx often produces, which have an enormous amount of meaning packed in to very few words, put it like this, that competition, capital can only exist as many capitals. In other words, what you're looking at, and perhaps if you didn't learn it from Karl Marx, you could have learned it from Margaret Thatcher, capitalism is fundamentally about competition. In every market, for every product, is based on that. And I've just put up some of the brands of supermarkets. Sainsbury's competes against Waitrose, against Asda, against Tesco, and so on in the vital international oil market. Shell competes against Mobil, competes against the international equivalents in every continent. And this is a fundamental and unalterable part of the system. No matter how big the units of capital become, whether they're global corporations or corner shops, they're involved in competition. Competition for new markets, competition for cheap sources of raw materials, competition for cheap labour. Every aspect of the system is governed by this. And of course, this is then linked to the geographical units, to the nation states in which those corporations operate. Marx said that the state is the executive committee for the management of the common affairs of the bourgeoisie, and this itself stems from the competitive nature of the system. The system can't simply have a kind of Wild West of a war of all against all. In fact, if you think about what happened in the actual Wild West in America, it was the slow imposition of a unified state system over a chaotic competitive environment that emerged from colonization moving east in the United States. But what is true there is true across the whole system. There has to be somewhere where the various competing interests of finance capital and industrial capital and the service industry and the banking sector are managed and defended in an extra economic way. The conditions of economic competition have to be guaranteed by extra economic means, by law, by the deployment of force, and so forth and so on. And the state is exactly that body which provides that. Not mainly. I mean, I've got two images there. One of the cabinet table with the. I'm sure the capitalist class feels exactly as we feel. They have a very poor and inadequate set of representatives in the state machine at the moment. But the state machine is by no means limited, luckily for them, I suppose, to the elected politicians. In fact, the elected politicians are a relatively minor part of it. The real state machine, the fundamental element of the state machine, is the ability to deploy force. Those two gentlemen at the bottom there, Lord Peter Ricketts and Lord Richmond, are senior army officers. Peter Ricketts is not only a senior, or was a senior army officer, he was also chair of the Joint Intelligence Committee. You may have heard him on Radio 4 earlier this week, reflecting on what happened in the Straits of Hormuz. And one of the things that he said is that the special relationship is dead. The special relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom is dead, in his words. And when a figure like that, deep in the state machine, deep at the heart of the political establishment, makes a statement like that, they're reorienting the entire capitalist class, not just in this country, but in Europe as a whole, towards a very different perspective than they've had over the whole of the post-war period. That's what the state machine is meant to do. It's meant to guarantee the extra economic conditions under which capitalist competition and the exploitation and oppression that goes with it can continue. Obviously, this results in competition at an extra economic level as well. It isn't that the state abolishes competition, it represents the joint view of the capitalists insofar as that can be arrived at through a political process, but it doesn't abolish competition, it elevates it to an interstate level. Just as Sainsbury's competes with Morrison's, competes with Tesco, so different capitalist states compete with one another. So the imperial drive, the drive to settle economic questions by the deployment of state forces, by military means, by the threat of or use of force, by the threat or use of warfare, is something which is ingrained in the interstate competition, which itself is a product of the fundamental condition of capitalism, which is economic competition. Above this, I mean, we can say that the state exists above the merely economic competition, but above interstate competition, there is nothing. There is just interstate competition. There is no world government. There is no effective United Nations. The United Nations is fundamentally, and always has been, even in its pre-Trump pristine condition, was always unable to stop this, just as the League of Nations before that was unable to stop this. The real secret of the United Nations, even in its prime, was that when the major powers in the Security Council were agreed, the United Nations acted. They acted in their interests. When they disagreed, this is what the veto is for, when they disagreed, it was powerless and paralyzed. So there is nothing above interstate competition. There is no Laplace's demon which governs the system. Pierre-Francois Laplace was a French philosopher. He imagined in the early part of the 19th century, what would it be like if there were an all-powerful, all-seeing eye that could control and predict every aspect of natural and social development. It was a thought experiment. There is no Laplace's demon in the capitalist system. There is no world government, no power above it. There is no Zeus looking down from Olympus, which can shape and contain the conflicts of the nation states. That's all there is. There is just competition between nation states. The nation states, of course, made up very different capacities and so forth and so on. That is what the imperial system is at its core. But that's not all there is to say, of course, about the way in which that system works, because capitalism wasn't just born in the world equally all over the globe. It developed, first of all, in this country, of course, in parts of Western Europe, in parts of North America, and those areas went through the Industrial Revolution first, gained the kind of power and capacity that a modern capitalist economy gives you, and therefore were the people who built the first empires, projected that, first of all, predominantly by sea power, in later cases by other means as well, and colonial power was born. The modern version of colonial power was born of that industrial expansion, that projection of industrial power from the core of the system to its peripheries. That's what produced the first colonial empires. I've just illustrated this, of course. I've just illustrated the fact that, of course, this changes over time. The British were one of the first, not the only, the Dutch as well, but one of the first colonial operations, and at their height, the map at the top, that's the British Empire. That's the British Empire at its height, of which, of course, it was truly said that the sun never set on the British Empire. Anti-colonialists were prone to point out that that was because God didn't trust the British in the dark. But however that might be, over time that changed. The bottom frame is what remains of that mighty empire today, a few scattered islands around the globe, replaced, of course, as the dominant imperial power by the United States after the Second World War. So the system is both uneven and at the same time in a process of constant change, where the great powers from the imperial empires rise and fall. We're living in a time of, Britain in particular, but generally, in which the initial form of colonies has changed at least twice. In the British Empire, direct colonial rule, the direct control, the direct administration of the Americas by Britain until as we're celebrating its 250th anniversary, 1776, and the Americans threw the British out. In India, direct colonial rule. The American Empire, which replaced it, of course, emerged in a period of massive anti-colonial revolt against the British and other European empires. Many of the states that had been direct colonial possessions became independent, and American imperialism, adapting to that, tended to rule not through direct colonial administration, but by using its economic weight, its developing economic weight, to secure power and influence in those post-colonial states, often posing, interestingly, and I make this because there's a direct comparison with the way in which Chinese diplomacy works at the moment, the Americans often presented themselves as not like the British, not like the Europeans, not interested in direct colonial administration, simply interested in using their enormous economic might to help newly developing nations prosper, and so on and so forth. And I say that because that directly part of American imperial ideology, that they weren't like the preceding empire, and it is directly now part of Chinese diplomacy to present itself in the same way. And we might argue that rising economic powers tend to rest on their economic weight, and declining imperial powers tend to rest on their accumulated military capacity. That's certainly part of the asymmetry now between China and the United States. This places the former colonies in a different position. You know, when you read, and this is a point I'm going to be coming on to, when you read a lot of the stuff about anti-colonial theory, remember you're reading about a time in which there was still anti-colonial revolts against the British empires, against the British and European empires which had direct colonial administration. I put here a picture of Saddam Hussein because the kind of post-colonial history of Iraq as an independent state shows some of the contradictions involved in this, because it's not quite so simple as it is when you've got an anti-colonial movement against a colonial power. Iraq, modern Iraq, is a post-colonial state. It's no longer a direct control of a European power. It's an independent state, at least formally. But of course, it's a subordinate state within the system, and its history, its relationship with imperial power, is quite complex. In the conflict with Iran, in the Iran-Iraq war, Iraq was backed by the Western powers because, whatever they thought of Saddam Hussein, they thought worse of the Iranian state. This is one of the places where Saddam Hussein begins to militarize the whole of the Iraqi state. He's an ally of the West. He's assisted in gaining the so-called super weapons by the British and the Americans. The invasion of Kuwait, which he thought he was doing with Western agreement, by the way, at the beginning, turns him into an enemy of the West. So we're looking at a complex relationship in which the post-colonial state's relationship with the modern imperial powers is contingent. It's contingent on the role they're playing at any one time in the total system of imperial relations. So now I want to talk about sort of aspects of that modern imperial system and how people think about it. And of course, one very, very powerful this kind of argument has always been part of the pro-imperial story, but it's particularly been a element in it from, I would say, the first post-Cold War conflict in the Balkans in 1999. That's where this kind of rhetoric became dominant, all the way through the Afghan, Iraq, Libya conflicts, and only really is being abandoned now by the Trump administration, which frankly couldn't care less about humanitarian justification one way or another. Although, having said that, although the ruling class may have dispensed with it, it persists in corners of the left. And the argument is, you will have heard it no doubt many times, that the population of whatever, Iraq, Iran, wherever, is oppressed by their government, and therefore this is justifying an imperial intervention to try and assist them in overcoming the oppression and exploitation that they face at the hands of their own people. Western powers, who couldn't have cared less about the condition of the Kurds in Iraq before they were going to war with Saddam Hussein, suddenly became apprised of the terrible plight of the Kurdish people in Iraq. They were suddenly possessed of care for women in Afghanistan, and Trump, typically Trump way, just says, yeah, we're just trying to stir up Iranians and get them to overthrow the regime because they've been shot at, and what the hell, you know. So that argument is very definitely there, and it's very definitely there still on the left. Now, it's not mistaken, of course, about the exploitative and oppressive nature of these regimes. What it's mistaken about is the idea that the Western powers could possibly resolve that question or assist in resolving that question. Only the day before yesterday, in practically all these cases, the Western regimes were very happy to do business with exactly these oppressive regimes and couldn't have cared less about the state of the population. We stand absolutely in solidarity with the oppressed and the exploited everywhere, including in the states which are being attacked by Western imperialism, but our case is that only they can resolve the conflict with their own governments, and that the Western powers are hypocritical and destructive when they attempt to intervene in the name of those people, and that we should not allow them to do that, and that it is our special responsibility to deal with our own government. No Afghan could deal with Tony Blair, no Iraqi could deal with Tony Blair, no Iranian could deal with Keir Starmer. Only we, only the citizens of this country, from whatever background, can do that most effectively. There is a kind of almost equal and opposite mistaken version of anti-imperialism, I think, which assumes that if a state is an enemy of the Western powers, it must be in some way a virtuous state, that my enemy's enemy is my friend. Now that, I would say, is a bad maxim in personal life, and an even worse one in international politics. It is not the case that simply because the Western powers are attacking a state, that it has any inherent virtues in and of itself, other than perhaps maybe standing up irresolutely or otherwise to that state, to that imperial power. The ideological coloration, the idea that if a state describes itself as anti-imperialist, or if a state describes itself as socialist, that we have to take that on face value, and if the imperialists are attacking it, it must be true. I don't think that's a sustainable or logical argument. It depends, whether states are democratic or socialist depends on who has power in that state. If it's a socialist state, then working class people must, this is the definition of socialism, working class people must democratically control that state. If that is not the case, then it's absolutely irrelevant, or not irrelevant, but it's not definitive what that state calls itself. And it's particularly, this is an argument obviously advanced in terms of state ownership. Frederick Engels had an answer to this long, long ago. He said, if nationalisation were the definition of socialism, then the regimental tailors in the army and the royal porcelain manufacturer would be socialist organisations. State control, in and of itself, tells us nothing unless we know who controls the state. And unless working people democratically control the state, then it is not a socialist institution. And the Nazis, of course, were famously very keen on nationalisation, and that certainly didn't make them socialists. A post-colonial past is one thing, and it may impact on the ideology and the responses of the population, as it still does, I would argue, in Ireland, for instance, but it doesn't tell you the nature of the modern state. States that were born of resistance to colonial oppression, who gained their independence through anti-colonial movements, once they are independent, they become states within the international capitalist system, subject to exactly the same economic pressures, presiding over very similar economies, reacting to economic competition and to military competition in the same way that any other state in the system has to. And that will be the fundamental determinant of their behaviour, not whatever ideological strength that they might, or their peoples might draw from their past. After all, as I've already pointed out, the American state was born of an anti-colonial revolution against the British. Nobody in their right mind would still say that it means that America today is an anti-colonial power, although among the population, as we see deep in some recesses of the American psyche, no kings has surfaced as a radicalizing element. I've spoken, I'll hurry a little bit now. I've spoken about this, but I just want to make this point about democracy. It's, as far as a socialist society is concerned, whether it might be in Cuba or China or wherever, democracy is not a dispensable condition of socialism. There are no socialist societies, and no society can seriously make a claim to be socialist if it's not democratic. Marxists have a critique of parliamentary democracy in the West, but the critique is that it's not democratic enough, not that we can dispense with it in the name of dictatorship. The case for socialism is that democracy that exists in some form in parliamentary democracies in the political sphere, to be real, has to be extended to the economic sphere. That unless people have control of the factory and the workplace, they ultimately won't have control of the political process. This is the birth point of Marxism. This is the argument of Marx about the Paris Commune, repeated by Lenin in State and Revolution. We are, as Marx was at his point where he entered into political development, radical democrats. And it is impossible to hold that a society, even if it calls itself socialist, is actually socialist unless working people, as they did in the Paris Commune, as they did in the early years of the Russian Revolution, exercise economic and political power in those societies. It's simply unthinkable that for decade after decade, authoritarian governments imposing their will on the population in ways which we would find absolutely unacceptable, even in the limited democracy of a parliamentary democracy, are in some way socialist society. So, where does this leave us? The imperial system is very much alive and well in the middle of the 21st century, but its form has changed at least twice in the history of modern capitalism and is evolving around us right now. It depends on our ability to see this system clearly, both in its history and in its current development, for us to be able to oppose it effectively. Even in post-colonial states, even in those states which are subject to imperialist attack, Class struggle is not abolished. Those nations are subject to imperialism, but they have internal class divisions just like any other society, and we have to be acutely aware of our duty of solidarity with the oppressed and exploited in those societies. But that solidarity with the oppressed nations can never become a reason for supporting our own imperialism. That is a horizontal solidarity between working classes, between the left in different countries. It can never run vertically through our own oppressive and exploitive state, which is claiming to intervene in other places on behalf of the exploited and oppressed in those countries. There is no way that a state as determined to keep people in low pay and poverty and paying for an armaments industry in this country is going to liberate Iranians from a state trying to do the same to them. And for this reason, the first duty, the main duty, most of what we talk about will be to attack our own state. No one else can do that. We are here, and simply saying or simply pretending that international solidarity is sympathy with or solidarity with some other group of people in some other place is an argument for not focusing the actual activity of people in this country in fighting their own government. The best thing that we could ever do for Afghans or Iraqis or Iranians is to stop our government and to stop the United States government determining their future. Our business is to get imperialism off their back and allow them and us to conduct a struggle against our own ruling class for social change and social liberation.